Every night you hear her croon a Russian lullaby.
It was Tsarist Russia that was unintentionally responsible for the birth of the popular song. Its anti-Semitism and vicious pogroms forced millions of Jews to flee to America. Among those refugees were the parents of George Gershwin and the 4-year-old Izzy Berlin, Irving Berlin. Over the next 30 years, the creative tensions between Jewish immigrants and the music they encountered in their adopted homeland would inspire a new era of popular song.
I'll build a stairway to paradise with a new step every day.
I'm stepping out with my baby. Can't go wrong, 'cause I'm in right. It's for sure, not for maybe, that I'm all dressed up tonight.
Most Russian immigrants, like the Gershwins and Berlins, arrived in New York City not knowing a word of English. They settled in the Lower East Side among a kaleidoscope of nationalities.
Because there were immigrants from so many other cultures, not just Jews, they were hearing the music of the Irish and the music of the Italians, and so they all combined. And perhaps the cross-fertilization of so many cultures that reached their ears. So there's a little Irish here and a little Italian there and a little Jewish there, and you can say they reflected the pulse of the city.
For him I cannot
stay. There were Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and they all hated each other cordially, and there were no contact, or the minimum of contact, between them. And I was told by my parents, for example, don't you play with the little nigger boys. So, of course, I went out and hunted up every black child I could find. There was no mixing as such. The blacks had their own group, separate ghettos of their own. The Jews had ghettos of their own.
One of the few black musicians who was appreciated across ethnic boundaries was Scott Joplin, the king of ragtime.
It was, I think, the first urban American music. It was the first music that is really about the city more than the country. It's about the fact that after slavery, these Negro American musicians had a certain kind of freedom of travel that allowed them to go from one city to another. We're no longer plantation work animals. We're out here now as city people.
Black dance rhythms swept New York. They came as a wake-up call to the young Jewish immigrants as a new generation turned their backs on their Yiddish theaters. Now they wanted to hear and write American music. George Gershwin's parents bought a piano to improve themselves. Irving Berlin ran away from home to sell newspapers on the street and to turn their stories into songs. He called this new music by an old name, ragtime.
Everybody's doing it, doing it, doing it. See that ragtime couple over there. Watch them throw.
Berlin's ragtime bore little resemblance to Scott Joplin's. Berlin used lyrics from the streets and rhythms from the dance floors of the big city.
Everybody's doing it, doing it, doing it.
You see, back then in the 1910s, ragtime was the rock and roll of its period. Young people danced to it. It was the music of the skyscraper. It was the music of modern America. In fact, one of Berlin's first hits was the clarion call, the anthem, the rock around the clock of ragtime. And the song, of course, Alexander's Ragtime Band. Why is it that? Because from the very beginning of the song, he's telling people to get with it, get with the new trend. Come on and hear Alexander's Ragtime Band.
It's the best band in the land. They can play a bugle call like you never heard.
One of the essences of a popular song is the sound, the drive. It's just got a great inbuilt rhythmic feel to it.
Come on along, let me take you by the hand. Come on the man, he's the leader of the band.
At the end of the song, he does something which is very characteristic of the Berlin of those days. He quotes from an older song, and if you want to hear the Swanee River played in ragtime, very clever, because he's catching people by saying, well, you know, I'm not that new. I know about the past.
And if it's got to hear the Swanee River in ragtime, come on along, come on and hear Alexander's Ragtime Band.
The syncopated rhythms of ragtime really were something new. People had been used to popular music, which more or less aped, quote-unquote, high-class European music. And ragtime, with rhythms lifted from African-American music, really injected a kind of vivacity into American pop culture, which hadn't been there before. The hue and cry about ragtime, of course, was largely tinged with anti-black racism. Its jungle rhythms are forever being maligned, but also there's a strain of anti-Semitism there because they're talking about sort of the Jewish psalm merchants who are pushing this horrible jungle music on America's youth. And there are really hilarious newspaper articles in which, you know, doctors and other experts are interviewed when they talk about how the jagged, syncopated rhythms of ragtime are going to drive everyone to distraction and what they're going to do to the central nervous systems of America's youth and how women are going to be sold into white slavery as a result of this music. So certainly this music was breaking through to the mainstream and was perceived as a threat as a result. There's been a pattern in American pop music mainstream assimilating elements of African American music, smoothing them out and selling them to mainstream white America, and moreover selling them to mainstream white American youth. And ragtime really was the first major musical revolution that followed this process. Happens again with jazz in the 1920s, and it of course famously happens with rock and roll in the 50s, and today it's happened with hip-hop rap music.
The music business that flourished in New York before Berlin's ragtime had been dominated by old-fashioned ballads and simple musical caricatures, peddled by powerful publishers like Harry von Tilzer.
The successful popular songwriter writes for the average piano player and the average singer. For instance, here is one of my coon songs. Rufus Rastus Johnson Brown, what you gonna do when the ring comes round? You'll notice the range of that song was only 6 notes. Why, a baby could almost sing it.
Over a long period of time was that ragtime created these stereotypes of black people that black performers themselves found that they had to address when they got out of slavery and went into show business.
So vaudeville theatres became a bizarre melting pot where black performers had to caricature themselves and black up as minstrels. Jewish actors also ridiculed themselves on stage. Better to laugh at than kill one another, they said.
The odd thing is there is this incredible symbiotic relationship between the black and the Jew. Certainly, I mean, they're both oppressed peoples, but certainly musically we find this too.
In fact, there were Jewish singers who even pretended they were black. Al Jolson, immigrant son of a Lithuanian rabbi, became America's top star by blacking up as a minstrel. One of his biggest blackface hits was a song by George Gershwin.
I've been away from you a long time. I never thought I'd miss you so. Somehow I feel your love is real. Near you I want to be. The birds are singing, it is song time. The banjo strumming soft and low. I know that you yearn for me too. Swanee, you're calling me.
George Gershwin's first major hit, Swanee, sounds like it could have been written for a Yiddish musical on the Lower East Side. Even the introduction in the music is a traditional introduction used in a lot of Yiddish theater songs. It's Jewish. I've been away from you a long time. I never thought I'd miss you so. Da 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 dee dee. Sure, that sounds Jewish, but it also sounds Polish and Russian and German, and it's lament.
Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee. I'd give the world to be among the folks in DIX. I even know my mammy's waiting for me, praying for me down by the Swanee. The folks up north won't see me no more when I get to that Swanee shore.
First thing about blackface is we have to understand that it comes out of minstrelsy. Minstrelsy was not invented to elevate Negroes. Minstrelsy was invented to get jobs for white guys who were imitating Negroes. The blackface is not just this performance mask. It's a rejection of his Jewish background and an embracing of American show business. So what we see then is that in a certain sense, blackface was also a window, if you will, through which Europeans could enter American show business. Now, what it became, ironically, was the first mass popular phenomenon in American culture.
Swanee was the first hit tune of the young George Gershwin. It was written in a section of New York named after the sound made by so many songs being auditioned all at once, Tin Pan Alley.
This is not art music. It was never intended to be a very specialized kind of a deal. Oh no, on the contrary, the more millions it could sell in sheet music and then in records, the better off you were. And so they were out to deliberately create hits. That's what Tin Pan Alley physically was and what it mentally is. It's a state of mind of commercialized popular music.
And on the other side, there's another Gershwin tune.
George listened very much to pianists of that period, black and white. He hung around all over New York, and so he listened to people like U.B. Blake. He listened to jazz pianists and ragtime pianists of that time. The advancement of American popular music at that time is due largely to the Jewish composers, but also to the black influence.
You know, now some people might complain that if you were white, even if you were Jewish, you got a better shot than if you were black and were Christian. Being a black Christian in a Christian country didn't help you as much as being white if you were Jewish helped you. See, George Gershwin doesn't represent Jews. He represents a genius first. He's a genius who is a Jew. You know, Irving Berlin is a popular songwriting genius who's a Jew, right? Duke Ellington is a genius who's black. But they all have one thing in common. Their genius is first, and then their ethnic category comes second. But a lot of times people try to put the ethnic thing in first, as though we can understand genius by going through somebody's ethnicity. That we'll never be able to figure out. Because if being Jewish allowed you to produce a bunch of George Gershwins, believe me, we'd have a whole lot more out here.
Say, do you know that you boys are a half hour late for this rehearsal?
George, I was never late in my life.
While we're waiting for them, let's take the chorus and the buck dance and strike up the band.
Good idea.
All right, kids, come on, let's go.
The thing that makes them who they are, finally, is that they're able to both use and transcend their ethnic backgrounds. And that's the key thing to greatness in American art, that you can totally use your background and transcend it if your talent is sufficient.
Someday he'll come along, the man I love, and he'll be big and strong, the man I love. And when he comes my way, I'll do my best to make him stay.
Now there's a progression that goes on there musically that's vintage Gershwin. Da 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 da. Da, 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 da. He put those notes into his piano variation of it. And that is quintessential Gershwin. It is those blue notes, those bent notes, those notes that are a little bit off the beaten path that you don't expect to hear. And so he's taken a beautiful melody, da-dee-da-dee-da-dee, and he's put these blue notes juxtaposed next to it. That's what makes it vintage Gershwin.
Still I'm sure to meet him one day. Maybe Tuesday will be my good news day. He'll build a little home just meant for two, from which I'll never roam. Who would you? And all else above, I'm waiting for the man I
The music that was created in the teens and 20s by these great writers influenced the world, not only America, but it changed the way the world looked at America. And it changed culture because people learned things about the world from the popular songs. The popular songs dictated morals. They dictated ideas about love. They gave people ideas and notions of romantic love that people didn't carry prior to these songs being created. They were incredibly popular and incredibly valuable in their ability to influence people, and that's why they were used as propaganda.
It's your country and my country with millions of real fighting men. It's your
Songwriters like Gershwin and Berlin, still conscious of their immigrant Jewish roots, wanted above all to become real Americans. At the time of the First World War, Irving Berlin had written many songs with a patriotic flavor. America had become his religion.
In 1917, Irving Berlin was drafted into the army, and he served as a soldier at it. And this, of course, was a whole new experience for him, to have to get up at 5 or 6 a.m. to reveille. I mean, he'd never done anything like that, at least since he'd been a songwriter, because his habit of working was to work all night long and then go to sleep and wake up at about 4 p.m. So his whole life had been reversed. It was like a permanent jet lag for him. And so he used his experience of getting up at the horrendous early hour to write this song called "Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning." Oh, how I hate to get up in the morning. Oh, how I'd rather remain in bed.
For the hardest blow of all is to hear the bugler call. You gotta get up, you gotta get up, you gotta get up this morning. Someday I'm going to murder the bugler. Someday they're going to find him dead. I'll amputate his reveille and step upon it heavily and spend the rest of my life in bed.
Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning was pure autobiography. And he wrote about that himself. That was a song from the heart. And when I was a child, that I knew was our family theme song. You know, and people will ask me, did your father sing you a lullaby? I say, yes. Oh, how I hate to get up in the morning.
You gotta get up, you gotta get up, you gotta get up this morning. Someday I'm going to murder the bugler. Someday you're going to find him dead.
And then I'll get that other pup, the guy who wakes the bugler up,
and spend the rest of my life in bed.
Irving Berlin was already a well-known songwriter, very wealthy, and he was invited to all kinds of social events by some of the best hostesses in town. And at one of them he met Mary Ellen Mackey, who was the daughter of the man who ran postal telegraphers, also a millionaire with a big home out in Long Island and a house on East 75th Street. She was very beautiful, striking, tall, and they just hit it off. Then when it got to be too apparently romantic, the old boy, her father, Mackey, did everything he could to stop it. He didn't want her to have anything to do with a Jew and a common songwriter, and especially a Lower East Side Jew at that. And so he even sent her off on trips so that Berlin wouldn't see her for long periods of time.
During those periods of enforced separation, Berlin wrote one of his most personal and autobiographical songs.
Of course, Berlin neither read nor wrote music. That doesn't matter, you can write perfectly good songs like that. He used to play in one key. The key is F sharp, the black notes of the piano. I mean, almost everything you play in these black notes plays a nice tune, pentatonic scale. I think one day he did this. Oh, that's nice. And he wrote a pretty waltz called I'll Be Loving You Always. You see,
courtship and subsequent marriage of Irving and Ellen created, there were headlines all over the place, and it was something that was fascinating to the public because it was really not proper in the eyes of many people for a Jew and a Gentile to marry. Berlin's family was more accepting of Ellen than Ellen's father, but of course during the Depression, Ellen's father had terrible financial problems, and Berlin was the one who bailed him out. And after that, all was well with both families.
The Berlins were enjoying the fruits of Irving's success, well away from the Jewish ghettos of the Lower East Side. Alongside the now fashionable George Gershwin, they mixed with high society. Berlin had married into it, and Gershwin performed for it in concert halls reserved for high culture. Gershwin believed that musical immortality would come from the classical podium, not the pop song.
The public embraced this, embraced the fact that he had one foot in Tin Pan Alley and the other in Carnegie Hall. But the critics didn't like it. They distrusted it. And some of the other composers distrusted it. they felt it came too easily for him, therefore it couldn't be good. It wasn't dense and complicated enough. I mean, it just had to be something wrong with it. And so Gershwin labored with that. But his contribution to all writers who've followed him has been to break down the barriers between vernacular music and symphonic music, from the classical world and the popular world.
Drums roll, saxes moan, trumpets blast. Fascinating rhythm, you got me on the go. Fascinating rhythm, I'm all quiver. What a mess you're making, the neighbors want to know why I'm all shaking just like a flipper.
When George Gershwin was writing a song called Fascinating Rhythm, the first title for this song was Syncopated City. Theaters were being built. It's when Broadway exploded with activity. You just hear the sound of the riveters, the buildings are going up. It was a sense of optimism and hope. You just have an enormous abundance of entertainment.
The 1920s and 30s, it seems to me, formed an extraordinary confluence of forces that made American popular culture flower. First, we had the development of radio, network radio.
George Gershwin, presiding over this program of modern music, presented for your entertainment by Phenamint, the chewing gum laxative. Remember, chew your laxative, and you will understand why over 15 million people have chosen Phenamint.
I got rhythm, I got music, I got finance, that's what anything more. I got daisies in green pastures, I got finance, that's for anything more. Old man Trouble, I don't mind him, you won't find him round my door. I got starlight, I got sweet dreams, I got finance, that's for anything more, that's for anything more.
We have radio for the first time disseminating songs overnight. Back in the 19th century, somebody like, let's say, Stephen Foster might write a song, and it would take a year before everybody would have an opportunity to hear it. Now, instantly, it was a hit. So the speed of everything, of cultural communication, was enormously heightened by commerce and technology.
America was on the move as never before. The riverboats that sailed the Mississippi were carrying new forms of improvised jazz, and performers like Louis Armstrong would help transform popular entertainment.
One of the things that's most fascinating about playing with Louis Armstrong on the riverboat is that the first set that they played, this first dance set on the riverboat, nobody danced. There was just white people on the boat. Nobody danced because these white people had never seen an actual Negro in a tuxedo before. So they just kind of stared at them for the first show, kind of like, wow, Negroes in tuxedos, playing horns. Wow. And then after about an hour of that, the next set they danced, right? But there's that moment. See, to me, that's like a signal moment about something in American society. That after all these minstrel shows and all that, right, to see Armstrong and Baby Dodds and Fate Marable and all of these other people in these tuxedos beautifully dressed and playing this music was like a shock. But again, they got used to it. And then they got out on this floor and tried to shake a tail feather, as it were. But that signal moment, I think, is something that tells us an enormous amount about what we were going to see more and more and more of in America.
A new awareness of black music was sweeping popular culture. Even composers who had until now preferred the polite traditions of European theatre bowed to its influence. Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein, both from Jewish families, now developed racial themes new to popular music.
Showboat, I think, is the single most important musical in the history of the American musical theater because it really marks a tremendous turning point. Never before had the American musical theater dealt with some of the themes that are inherent in Showboat, the intermarriage between people of two races. And then, too, the idea of a black and white cast appearing together in a Broadway show. Unheard of. And that they were singing together on the stage at the same time was even more remarkable. So Showboat was a work of tremendous danger. The racial attitudes in the original version of Showboat, which no one has seen since the late 1930s because the show has been rewritten so many times, I think is a very daring one. It opens with a phenomenal quatrain. Niggers all work on the Mississippi. Niggers all work while the white folks play, loading up boats with the bales of cotton, getting no rest till the judgment day. Imagine what this meant to 1920s audiences, that the curtain would go up on this gala first night in this brand new, gleaming, beautiful theater. People, women dripping in diamonds, and men in their top hats, white ties, and tails, and seeing a chorus of black laborers lifting bales of cotton and singing that phenomenal quatrain. This was stunning, stupefying to those audiences. God, I hate political correctness. It always mucks up everything. And they keep changing niggers all work to darkies all work to colored folks work. Everything else I find racially denigrating. Niggers all work is the right word, because niggers is the word that those black people in the 1920s in the South that is being depicted in the show would use. Everything else looks like a liberal Caucasian's self-conscious acceptance of a situation they'd rather not be thinking about.
We sweat and strain, body all aching and rain.
Showboat's new realism is embodied in the song that later became an anthem for Paul Robeson in his struggle for civil rights.
Gets a little drunk and your land's in jail. I get weary and sick of trying. I'm tired of living and scared of dying, but old man River, he just keeps rolling
on. So Broadway's portrayal of American society was changing. No more black minstrels and coon songs now. Irving Berlin, who'd always used his songs to make topical comments, wrote a new show based on tabloid headlines.
It's very interesting indeed that Berlin started in the early days selling newspapers, because in 1933 he wrote a musical show called As Thousands Cheer, the conceit of which was newspaper headlines for which he wrote songs for every scene. And he wrote every kind of song for that show. For the weather report he wrote, "We're having a heat wave, a tropical heat wave." So that was the weather page. He wrote the society page. "In your Easter bonnet," wrote that. Then there was a very poignant song, and there was a headline that said, "Black man lynched by mob," or "Negro man lynched by mob." And that's when Ethel Waters sang a song which was forever connected with her. Supper time, I must set the table, 'cause it's supper time. Somehow I ain't able, 'cause that man of mine ain't coming home no more. That's an extraordinary achievement for Broadway in 1933, to have a song like that performed when an audience was very accustomed to light entertainment, and suddenly they're confronted with a very important social issue that was largely neglected at that time. certainly Berlin was thinking about his own family's exodus from Russia, all of the pogroms and demonstrations against Jews that caused the mass exodus of all those people to America and other places. And so he certainly felt very deeply about what he was writing, and it certainly shows in that piece of music, because musically it is very sophisticated, very Gershwin-esque in its harmonies, and perfect for Ethel Waters.
Supper time, I must set the table 'cause it's supper time. Somehow I ain't able 'cause that man of mine ain't coming home no more. Supper time, kids will soon be yelling for their supper time. How'll I keep from telling them that man of mine ain't coming home no more?
That song is amazing because it was written for a specific thing. It was reflecting my father's feelings about an outrage. But it was also a most extraordinary song about loss.
Somehow I ain't able 'cause that man of mine ain't coming home no more.
It was a very daring thing to do. He had to pay for it in many ways. The other stars in the show, one was Clifton Webb, refused to come out and bow with Ethel Waters at the end of the show. And they refused for a few times, and he heard about it and said from now on, there'll be no bows at all. And so, of course, they changed their minds, didn't they? There were, of course, racial situations, and we were living in an entirely segregated society in America. There was no open rebellion, but people were certainly talking about the inequity of that. And as a young black child, I simply took that on the chin. I thought, well, this is the way it has to be.
But Broadway itself was changing, and not just in its reflection of racial issues. Shows were closing by the dozen. The birth of the sound film offered a new big-screen realism.
I walk a million miles for one of your smiles on my
And then came the Wall Street crash. The songwriters lost their theatres and their savings. But a saviour beckoned: Hollywood. The studios desperately needed more songs for their musicals. After buying up Tin Pan Alley and then the Broadway stars, they sent for Berlin, Gershwin and friends, and paid them handsomely.
Nothing but blue skies do I see. Oh, don't bluebirds singing a song. Nothing but
Irving Berlin, once described as the toughest Jewish businessman I ever met, adapted easily to the demands of the Hollywood moguls.
never saw things going so right. Noticing the day.
While enjoying the good life, this songwriting chameleon ran off a string of hits for the new superstars of Hollywood. All 5 of Berlin's songs for the movie topped the new radio hit parade as the early pop music business spread its wings across America.
Why, I'm listening to the radio theater.
Gentlemen, you're about to be interviewed.
Wait till I fix my tie.
Don't you like being interviewed?
Well, I don't mind, as long as you don't ask us which we write first, the words or the music.
The Broadway songwriters had become celebrities in their own right. Soon others arrived in Hollywood. Richard Rodgers and Larry Hart. They'd been rocketed to fame by their earlier hit, Manhattan.
The city's noises cannot describe
The dreams of a boy and girl will turn Manhattan
into an
of joy.
Rodgers and Hart depicted in a newsreel the frustrations of songwriters hired and fired by the Philistines of Hollywood.
It's all your fault. My fault? All you did was talk about your lyrics. Why didn't you let me play the music for him? I'm sick of this racket. Now you'll have to go into the real estate business with your father. Come on.
Lorenz Hart was unhappy. He wrote a song with Rodgers called Glad to Be Unhappy, but I don't think he was glad to be unhappy at all. He suffered terribly, and became impossible in the end for Rodgers to keep working with him because he drank too much and he just wasn't reliable.
And no one was more fed up with the Hollywood songwriting racket than George Gershwin, who hated losing control of his music to soulless movie producers. Despite his glamorous lifestyle, he desperately needed a new musical challenge uncompromised by Hollywood's seductive money-making machine. In 1934, Gershwin began rehearsals for an ambitious stage production painstakingly researched in the Gullah Negro community of South Carolina.
He liked to know things from the inside. And so he had a real emotional involvement with something. I mean, when he went south, I mean, he'd go to the churches and sing along with the church people in the churches. He'd go to the dances and dance. He would clap his hands. He'd get loud. He was an aggressive guy. He'd get all the way in there because he wanted to find out what that felt like in the middle of it. But in order to avoid the kind of simple-minded stuff that people engage in today that has nothing to do with the aesthetic process in which they talk about this white man stole this from that black person, this black person stole this from that white person. All artists who are serious steal. So if you're a serious artist and you don't steal, you need to be in another business. See, if you're a serious artist, you seek out the very best thing that you can find and you snatch as much of that and put it in your stuff as you can. Now, if you have sufficient talent, you will remake that, and people will begin to recognize that that's your version of it. See, that's why Gershwin was absolutely fearless.
Porgy and Bess would change America's racial attitudes to entertainment. Its all-black cast desegregated opera houses as black and white audiences sat together for the first time. The critics who cynically described Porgy and Bess as a stirring together of Israel and Africa unconsciously hit the mark. This folk opera symbolized the fusion of black and white song forms that had painstakingly evolved over the previous 30 years.
I'm sure by that time in George's career, the Jewish music and Negro music were in many ways the same as far as their source, where they came from. He wanted to express not only the story of Porgy, but he wanted to express the struggle of black culture in American history. He was writing very, very seriously at that time, and there was never a point in his collaboration, from what I'm told, that he was worried about not properly representing the black people. He simply knew that it was something he could do.
And the living is easy. Fish are jumping, and the cotton is high. don't you cry.
Since the immigrant families of Gershwin and Berlin arrived in New York, the popular song had evolved from minstrelsy and nostalgia into the fledgling pop music industry. The creative tensions between Jewish and black musicians had forged a powerful new force that challenged fashions, morals and prejudices in America and across the world.
Spread your wings and you take to the sky.
In the 30 years or so since those Jewish families fled their Russian homeland, they had planted the seeds for the pop song as we know it today.
There's nothing can harm you with Daddy and Mommy standing by. So